The faded falcon tattoo wrapped around Mara Vance's forearm had been the source of countless jokes at Fort Grayson. New recruits would snicker, calling it a garage special, or worse. But when Colonel Damon Rourke caught sight of that same mark during a routine inspection, his face went white as fresh chalk. Without hesitation, he stripped off his jacket, revealing an identical tattoo on his shoulder. "She's not logistics," he whispered to his aide, his voice trembling. "She's former Unit Aegis. Only 7 of us made it out alive." What happened next would shake the very foundations of everything the Army thought they knew about the quiet woman who fixed their vehicles. The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the motor pool at Fort Grayson, casting harsh shadows between the rows of military vehicles that stretched across the compound like metal monuments to American might. Mara Vance swiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her grease-stained hand, leaving a dark smudge across her forehead as she bent back over the engine of an armored truck that had been giving the mechanics trouble for 4 days. The sound of her wrench clicking against metal rang out in steady rhythm, punctuated by the distant shouts of drill instructors putting recruits through their paces on the nearby parade ground. At 31, Mara had settled into a comfortable routine of anonymity within the sprawling military base. She arrived each morning at 0615 hours, punched her time card, and disappeared into the maze of vehicles where she could work in relative peace. Her colleagues knew her as reliable, competent, and refreshingly drama-free, a woman who could diagnose engine problems with an almost supernatural intuition and who never complained about the long hours or the back-breaking work that came with keeping over 300 military vehicles operational. What they didn't know, what nobody at Fort Grayson suspected, was that Mara Vance had once been someone entirely different. The woman who now spent her days elbow-deep in engine grease had previously moved through shadows and places most people couldn't pronounce, carrying out missions that would never appear in any official military record. The transformation from that life to this one had been deliberate, calculated, and absolutely necessary for her survival. The tattoo on her left forearm served as both a reminder and a burden, a piece of permanent ink that connected her to a past she had worked desperately to leave behind. The design itself appeared deceptively simple, a minimalist falcon perched on a compass rose, rendered in fading black ink, that suggested it had been applied years ago by someone who valued function over artistry. To the casual observer, it looked like the kind of tattoo a young person might get on impulse, perhaps during a wild weekend in some military town where tattoo parlors stayed open late to catch soldiers looking to commemorate their service with permanent reminders etched into their skin. The reality was far more complex, and infinitely more dangerous. Private Lucas Moreno was the first to comment on it, barely 3 weeks into his deployment to Fort Grayson. Fresh out of boot camp, with the kind of cockiness that only came from surviving 14 weeks of controlled hell, he spotted the tattoo while Mara was reaching into the engine compartment of his unit's transport vehicle. "Nice ink, Vance," he said with a smirk. "Did you lose a bet or something? That thing looks like it was done with a ballpoint pen." Mara didn't look up from her work, her fingers continuing to probe the engine's innards with practiced efficiency. "It's functional," she replied simply, her voice carrying the kind of flat disinterest that usually discouraged further conversation. But Moreno was young and hadn't yet learned to read the subtle warning signs that more experienced soldiers recognized instinctively. "Functional how?" he pressed, emboldened by what he mistook for shyness. "Does it help you fix trucks better? Maybe it's like a magic mechanic charm or something." His comment drew chuckles from the other recruits who had gathered around to watch the interaction, their laughter carrying the edge of cruelty that young men often displayed when they thought they had found an easy target. The sound of their mockery drifted across the motor pool, reaching the ears of Sergeant Trent Gallagher, who was conducting his daily equipment inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had earned him 3 stripes and the respect of his superiors. Gallagher had been watching Mara work for 6 months now, and while he had noticed the tattoo, he had also noticed something else, something that the younger soldiers were too inexperienced to detect. There was a quality to the way Mara moved, a controlled precision in her gestures, and a constant awareness of her surroundings that spoke of training far beyond standard military vehicle maintenance. "Moreno," Gallagher barked, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. "How about you worry less about Vance's tattoos, and more about learning to do your job without breaking something expensive?" The rebuke was sharp enough to scatter the gathering crowd, but Gallagher caught the brief flash of gratitude in Mara's eyes before she returned her attention to the engine. And he filed that moment away in the part of his mind where he stored observations that didn't quite fit the official narrative. As weeks turned into months, the comments about Mara's tattoo became a running joke among certain circles of the base. New arrivals would invariably notice it and feel compelled to comment, as if the simple act of acknowledging its existence somehow established their place in the base's informal hierarchy. Some suggested she should have it covered up, or removed. Others speculated about its origins, with the kind of creative storytelling that flourished in military barracks, where gossip was one of the few forms of entertainment readily available. Mara endured it all with the same stoic patience she brought to every other aspect of her carefully constructed new life. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to herself in any way, even to defend against mockery, was a luxury she couldn't afford. The tattoo was visible, unchangeable, a permanent marker of her past that she had accepted as part of the price of her current existence. Better to let them think it was meaningless, a youthful mistake, or a memorial to some forgotten boyfriend, than to reveal the truth about what those intertwined symbols really represented. The falcon perched on the compass wasn't just decorative art. It was a mark of membership in something that officially didn't exist, a brotherhood forged in places where maps ended, and GPS signals couldn't penetrate. Unit Aegis had been created in the shadows between different branches of military intelligence, a small team of specialists tasked with operations that were too sensitive for conventional forces, and too dangerous for regular special operations units. They worked without official backing, without recognition, and without the safety net of government acknowledgement if things went wrong. And things had gone very, very wrong. The memory of that final mission still visited Mara in the early hours before dawn, when the base was quiet and her mind couldn't distract itself with the familiar rhythms of work. She would lie in her narrow bunk in the enlisted women's quarters, staring at the ceiling while her subconscious replayed fragments of that night in vivid, unwelcome detail, the sound of automatic weapons fire echoing off canyon walls, the acrid smell of burning fuel, the weight of a wounded teammate across her shoulders as she struggled through terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to attempt passage. 9 people had gone into those mountains. Only 7 had come out, and 2 of those hadn't survived the extraction. The official story, insofar as there was an official story at all, attributed their mission to a training accident in a remote area of Utah. The casualty reports were buried in classified files that would remain sealed for decades, and the surviving members of Unit Aegis were quietly reassigned to positions where they could be monitored and contained. Mara's reassignment to vehicle maintenance at Fort Grayson had been presented as a reward for her service, an opportunity to use her technical skills in a safe environment, while the Army decided what to do with someone who knew too much about operations that had never officially occurred. She understood it for what it really was, a comfortable form of house arrest where she could be useful without being dangerous, where her skills could contribute to the larger military machine, while her knowledge remained safely contained within the boundaries of a base where every conversation could be monitored and every movement tracked. The routine of her new life had a numbing quality that she found both comforting and disturbing. Each day followed the same pattern, the same faces, the same problems that could be solved with the right tools and sufficient patience. She became expert at diagnosing mechanical failures, at understanding the complex systems that kept military vehicles operational under conditions that would destroy civilian counterparts. There was something deeply satisfying about working with machines that responded predictably to proper maintenance, that followed logical rules and could be repaired with skill and determination. Unlike the human machinery of covert operations, vehicles didn't lie, didn't betray their teammates, and didn't leave their people behind in hostile territory when political considerations outweighed moral obligations. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had found peace working on machines designed for war, while trying to forget her experiences in actual combat. The armored trucks and transport vehicles she maintained would carry soldiers into dangerous situations, but they would do so openly, as part of officially acknowledged operations with clear chains of command and established rules of engagement. The men and women who depended on her work would have the backing of the United States government, medical support if they were wounded, and recognition if they were killed in service to their country, all things that Unit Aegis had been denied. Colonel Damon Rourke arrived at Fort Grayson on a Monday morning in mid-October, his presence announced by the kind of administrative flurry that accompanied high-ranking officers wherever they went. Word spread quickly through the base that they had a new commanding officer, a career soldier with an impressive service record who had specifically requested assignment to Grayson after completing a tour in the Mediterranean that had earned him commendation from the Joint Chiefs themselves. Rourke was 53 years old, tall and lean with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in difficult places doing difficult things. His dark hair was streaked with silver and cut in the regulation style that made him indistinguishable from a dozen other colonels, but there was something in his eyes, a particular quality of watchfulness that suggested he had seen more than his fair share of action beyond the reach of conventional military operations. His first week at Fort Grayson was spent in the kind of meet and greets that were standard for new commanding officers, formal introductions to department heads and informal conversations with senior enlisted personnel who could provide him with the kind of unvarnished assessment of base operations that never appeared in official reports. Rourke approached these interactions with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized his entire military career, asking detailed questions and listening carefully to the answers while forming his own impressions of the base's strengths and weaknesses. It was during his second week, while conducting a comprehensive inspection of base facilities, that Colonel Rourke first encountered Mara Vance. The motor pool inspection had been scheduled for 1,430 hours, giving the maintenance staff enough time to prepare their work areas for the kind of scrutiny that commanding officers were famous for applying to every aspect of base operations. Sergeant Trent Gallagher had spent the morning ensuring that every tool was in its proper place, every work order was properly documented, and every member of his team understood the importance of making a good impression on their new commanding officer. Mara approached the inspection with the same quiet professionalism she brought to everything else, making sure her work area was clean and organized while mentally preparing to answer questions about vehicle maintenance schedules and repair procedures. Colonel Rourke moved through the motor pool with practiced efficiency, stopping at each workstation to examine equipment and ask questions about operational procedures. His questions were intelligent and specific, revealing a deep understanding of military logistics that impressed the maintenance staff and put them at ease with their new commanding officer. When he reached Mara's workstation, she was in the process of replacing the transmission in a transport truck that had suffered a catastrophic failure during a training exercise the previous week. The work required her to position herself partially underneath the vehicle, her arms extended upward as she worked to disconnect the heavy transmission from the engine block. The position left her forearms exposed, and the falcon tattoo was clearly visible in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the motor pool. Rourke stopped walking. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, the colonel simply stood there, his eyes fixed on the tattoo with an intensity that was completely at odds with the casual nature of the inspection. The change in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, a sudden stillness that suggested he had seen something that challenged his understanding of the situation in a fundamental way. Sergeant Gallagher, who had been providing a running commentary on maintenance procedures, noticed the colonel's sudden silence and followed his gaze to where Mara was working. "That's Vance, sir," he said, assuming the colonel's attention had been caught by her unusual positioning under the truck. "One of our best mechanics, she's got an instinct for diagnosing problems that I've never seen matched." Rourke didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to where Mara was working, his movement careful and deliberate in a way that suggested he was processing information that went far beyond routine inspection protocols. "Vance," he said, and there was something in the way he pronounced her name that made Mara freeze in the middle of loosening a bolt. She carefully set down her tools and slid out from underneath the truck, coming to attention with the automatic precision that was drilled into every member of the military from their first day of basic training. Her eyes met Rourke's briefly before shifting to the regulation position, slightly above and to the right of his shoulder, but that brief moment of eye contact was enough to confirm what the colonel had already begun to suspect. "At ease," Rourke said, though his own posture remained rigid with the kind of tension that came from recognizing a face from a past that was supposed to stay buried. His gaze shifted to her forearm, where the falcon tattoo was clearly visible now that she was standing upright, and for several seconds, the motor pool was filled with the kind of silence that made everyone present acutely uncomfortable. Sergeant Gallagher cleared his throat, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but unable to understand what it might be. "Sir, is there something specific about Vance's work that you'd like to discuss? Her performance reports have been exemplary, and she's never had any disciplinary issues." Rourke seemed to remember where he was, and why he was there, though his eyes never left the tattoo on Mara's arm. "What's the significance of that tattoo, Vance?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested the answer was far more important than the casual nature of the question would indicate. Mara felt her heart rate increase, but her expression remained neutral as she considered her response. This was the moment she had been dreading since the day she had been assigned to Fort Grayson, the inevitable confrontation with someone who might recognize the significance of the mark she carried. "It's personal, sir," she replied, using the kind of non-answer that was technically truthful while revealing nothing of substance. "A reminder of past experiences." Rourke studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. There was recognition in his eyes, but also confusion, as if he was trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with someone he had known in a completely different context. Without another word, Colonel Rourke began removing his uniform jacket, his movements deliberate and purposeful in a way that captured the attention of everyone present. The jacket came off smoothly, revealing the standard-issue military undershirt that every soldier wore beneath their uniform. Then he pulled the undershirt over his head, exposing his torso to the shocked stares of the maintenance team. On his left shoulder, rendered in the same faded black ink as Mara's tattoo, was an identical falcon perched on a compass rose. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of base operations that seemed to fade into irrelevance as everyone present tried to process what they were seeing. Sergeant Gallagher's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, while the other mechanics simply stared in bewilderment at their commanding officer's unexpected revelation. Rourke's eyes never left Mara's face as he stood there, shirtless in the middle of the motor pool, his tattoo clearly visible to everyone present. "She's not logistics," he said, speaking to Gallagher but looking directly at Mara. "She's former Unit Aegis. Only 7 of us made it out." Rourke slowly put his undershirt back on, his movements careful and measured as he regained his composure. The brief moment of vulnerability had passed, but its impact continued to reverberate through the motor pool like ripples on a still pond. When he was fully dressed again, he turned to Sergeant Gallagher with the kind of authoritative bearing that reminded everyone present of his rank and position. "Sergeant Gallagher, I need to speak with Vance privately," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a direct order. "The rest of you can continue with your duties, but I want it understood that what just happened here doesn't leave this motor pool." "That's not a request." Gallagher nodded quickly, his confusion evident, but his obedience absolute. "Yes, sir." "You heard the colonel. People, back to work and keep your mouth shut about what you just saw." The maintenance team dispersed with the kind of reluctant efficiency that came from following orders they didn't entirely understand, casting curious glances back at Mara and Rourke as they returned to their respective workstations. Within minutes, the motor pool had returned to its normal rhythm of activity, though the undercurrent of speculation was almost palpable in the air. Rourke waited until they had relative privacy before speaking again, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard by the other mechanics. "We need to talk," he said simply. Mara nodded her agreement, understanding that the conversation they were about to have would fundamentally alter the careful equilibrium she had maintained for the past 2 years. "Your office or mine, sir?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood the gravity of the situation they both found themselves in. "Neither," Rourke replied. "There's a place on base where we can speak freely. Meet me at Building 12 in 30 minutes. Come alone, and don't mention this conversation to anyone." Building 12 was located in a section of Fort Grayson that most personnel rarely had occasion to visit, a nondescript structure that housed administrative offices and conference rooms used primarily for classified briefings and sensitive meetings. Mara arrived exactly 30 minutes after Rourke had specified, her punctuality reflecting the military precision that had been drilled into her during years of service in units where timing could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Rourke was already waiting for her in a small conference room on the 2nd floor, a space that was notable for its lack of windows and the presence of electronic equipment that suggested it was regularly swept for surveillance devices. he had changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes, and the transformation made him seem somehow more human, less like a distant authority figure and more like someone who had shared experiences that few other people could understand. "Close the door," he said as she entered, and Mara complied before taking a seat across from him at the small conference table that dominated the room. For several moments, neither of them spoke, both seeming to struggle with the weight of recognition and the implications of what their mutual presence at Fort Grayson might mean. Finally, Rourke broke the silence. "I thought you were dead," he said simply, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and confusion that suggested the news of her survival was both welcome and unexpected. "The after-action reports said there were only 6 survivors from the extraction. Your name wasn't on any of the lists I saw." Mara nodded slowly, understanding now why her presence at Fort Grayson had been such a shock to him. "Officially, I am dead," she replied. "At least, Mara Vance is dead. The woman you knew in Unit Aegis was someone else entirely, and she died in those mountains along with Ellis and Navarro." The mention of their fallen teammates brought a moment of silence to the room, a brief memorial to colleagues who had given their lives in service to operations that would never be acknowledged or honored in any public way. Rourke's expression darkened with memories that were clearly still painful, and Mara could see that he, like her, carried the weight of survivor's guilt that came from walking away from situations where others hadn't been so fortunate. "What happened to you after the extraction?" Rourke asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "I tried to track down everyone who made it out, but your trail went cold after the debriefing in Germany. It was like you simply vanished." "I was given a choice," Mara explained, her words careful and measured, as she navigated the sensitive details of her transition from covert operations to her current assignment. "The same choice all of us were given, I imagine, except reassignment to a position where my knowledge could be contained and monitored, or face the possibility of more permanent solutions to the problem of what I knew." Rourke nodded grimly, understanding the euphemistic language she was using to describe decisions that had been made at levels far above their respective pay grades. "I chose reassignment as well," he admitted. "Though my path back to conventional military service was somewhat more direct than yours appears to have been. They couldn't make me a colonel overnight without raising questions," Mara said with a bitter smile. "So they made me a mechanic instead. It's actually not a bad cover when you think about it. Nobody pays attention to the people who fix their vehicles, and the work is satisfying in its own way." "But you're wasted here," Rourke said, his frustration evident in his voice. "The skills you demonstrated in Unit Aegis, the tactical knowledge, the operational experience, all of it is being squandered on routine maintenance work." "With respect, sir, that's exactly the point," Mara replied. "I'm not supposed to be using those skills anymore. I'm supposed to be safely contained in a position where I can't cause any embarrassment to the people who decided that Unit Aegis had become too much of a liability to continue supporting." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, a reflection of years spent coming to terms with the reality that her service to her country had been deemed inconvenient by people who had never faced the kinds of dangers she had willingly accepted as part of her duties. Rourke seemed to recognize that bitterness, perhaps because he had experienced similar feelings during his own transition back to conventional military service. "How much do you know about why I'm here?" he asked, shifting the conversation in a direction that suggested he had information that might be relevant to her situation. "About my assignment to Fort Grayson, I mean." "Nothing beyond the standard gossip," Mara admitted. "You requested the assignment after completing a tour in the Mediterranean. Impressive service record. Commendation from the Joint Chiefs. The usual credentials that come with colonel rank." Rourke smiled humorlessly. "The truth is somewhat more complex than that. I didn't request this assignment, it was given to me. Just like your assignment to the motor pool was given to you. The difference is that my orders came with additional responsibilities that go beyond standard base command duties." Mara felt a familiar tension building in her chest, the kind of alertness that had once served her well in hostile environments where danger could emerge from unexpected directions. "What kind of additional responsibilities?" "The kind that involve keeping track of former Unit Aegis personnel," Rourke replied, his words carrying implications that were both reassuring and disturbing. "There are 7 of us scattered across different assignments, different bases, different branches of service. My job, among other things, is to monitor our welfare and ensure that we're all adjusting successfully to our new roles. And if we're not adjusting successfully? Mara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Then other arrangements would need to be made, Rourke said simply, confirming her fears with the kind of bureaucratic language that was often used to describe decisions that were both final and irreversible. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and Mara found herself re-evaluating everything about her assignment to Fort Grayson in light of this new information. She had assumed that her posting was simply a convenient way for the Army to keep her out of trouble while making use of her technical skills. But Rourke's presence suggested that the situation was far more complex, and potentially dangerous, than she had realized. "So you're here to watch me," she said, stating the obvious conclusion that followed from what he had told her. "Among other things," Rourke confirmed. "Though I have to admit, I'm somewhat relieved to discover that you're adjusting as well as you appear to be. Your performance reports have been exemplary, and there's been no indication that you're having difficulty with the transition to civilian-style duties." "Because I've been very careful to give exactly that impression," Mara replied. "I understood from the beginning that my continued survival depended on convincing the right people that I was no longer a threat to anyone." Rourke leaned forward, his expression intense as he studied her face. "But that's not entirely true, is it? You are still a threat, just a carefully contained one. The skills you learned in Unit Aegis don't simply disappear because you've stopped using them." Neither of them smiled.